Hey guys, so the series that I'm going to be going through these next couple weeks is Moved with Compassion. So when we see Jesus throughout the Gospels, we see that he has compassion for people, but he doesn't just leave it at that. He doesn't leave it at a feeling, but he makes it an action. He acts upon that feeling of compassion. So the first we're going to talk about is the story of the blind beggar. And we're going to talk about how encountering Christ and a call to discipleship is present in this passage. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have accounts of a blind beggar being healed, but Mark is the most detailed in this interaction. So we're going to go off that passage if you want to follow along. Mark 10:46 through 52. It says, "And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he had heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' And they called the blind man, saying to him, 'Take heart, get up, he is calling you.' And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And the blind man said to him, 'Rabbi, let me recover my sight.' And Jesus said to him, 'Go your way, your faith has made you well.' And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way." So in this passage, it doesn't explicitly say that Jesus moved with compassion, but we see that in his actions. The other stories we're going to talk about in the future are going to explicitly say Jesus had compassion. So follow along with me on this one. We're going to look more into this story. So in Mark 10:46 through 52, we see Jesus perform yet another miracle and display his compassion and power. As Jesus was leaving Jericho on the last leg of his journey from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem, followed by his disciples and a crowd of pilgrims who were traveling to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, he encounters a blind beggar sitting on the side of the road. The blind beggar, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, cries out to the Messiah, Jesus, son of David, to have mercy upon him. Many in the crowd endeavor to silence this beggar. He is tenacious and persistent. Jesus stops in his tracks and tells his disciples to bring the man to him. When Bartimaeus hears this, he throws off his cloak with anticipation and hurries to Jesus. Jesus asks Bartimaeus what he wanted, to which he responds, "Let me recover my sight." Jesus says his faith made him well, and at that moment, Bartimaeus' sight is restored and he began following Jesus. John Marcus was writing to the Christians of Rome who had little or no understanding of Jewish traditions. So John Marcus is the author of the book of Mark. And the purpose of the book of Mark is to share the good news about God's redemptive purposes finding their fulfillment in Jesus' life and ministry. Jesus is presented as the long-expected Messiah and Son of God throughout the book of Mark. Mark trying to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus is Messiah by presenting the life of Jesus Christ. Who Jesus was is revealed by what he does, not necessarily his teachings, and we see that in this passage. So back then, the culture, we're going to talk about a little bit about the culture right now. They lived in an honor-shame collectivistic society. So every person carried a known status of honor, and so did their family. One could gain honor through their actions or lose honor by doing shameful things. However, we see Jesus defy this honor-shame culture by treating people as having intrinsic value. So value just in and of itself, not by doing an action or by doing a shameful action, but just because they are a creation of God. We see this in the passage in Mark where Jesus heals Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus likely has a low honor status since the crowd pushed him to the side and tried to keep him quiet, but Jesus calls him over. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, they lived in a collectivistic culture. Value and identity was found in terms of the groups to which they belonged to. Bartimaeus was a beggar. There wasn't much value or high sense of esteem found in that group, right? So the rise of the Roman Empire provided an opportunity for improved economic conditions in Judea, with its improved safety for travel and improved ships for exchange of goods. However, taxation rates were at about 50% during the time of Jesus. It's no wonder Bartimaeus, a blind man, had to be a beggar to survive. For the normal person, everything had to work perfectly to survive the tax rate. People often took loans for the off-season of their business, and when they could not pay back those loans, their property was taken and family was sold into slavery. Obviously, it would be difficult for Bartimaeus, a blind man, to be hired for work, to have a business, or to do work as a slave. The Jews of the day saw disabilities as a mark of your own sin or the sins of your parents. Bartimaeus would have been seen as some kind of vile sinner merely because of his blindness, and it would have been perceived as God's justice that Bartimaeus was blind. This makes what Jesus did all the more significant and compassionate. At the beginning of the story, we are introduced to Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, sitting on the side of the road as Jesus walks by with the disciples and a large crowd. He's on the outside of Jesus' followers, but he notices them and wants to be a part of them. Since he is blind because his eyes have not yet been opened by Jesus, he is a beggar because he needs help from other people. As a consequence, Bartimaeus is by the side of the road, not yet on the road that leads to sight and life. Names and titles are extremely important in the biblical context, so let's break down the names we see in this pericope. Pericope is another word for story of the Bible, right? It has been difficult to determine whether Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, is Greek or Aramaic. However, Bartimaeus in Aramaic form and son of Timaeus in Greek translates to son of honor. This suggests that the text is about honor and shame, which is what determined value in their culture. Essentially, we are introduced to the son of honor being a blind man sitting by the roadside begging to survive. Jesus was one of the most common names in the first century in Palestine. Even though Jericho is far from Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth had a reputation as a healer that spread far beyond Galilee. The title Son of David is a messianic title. The Jewish people understood that their Messiah would be a descendant of King David. Bartimaeus, hailing Jesus as Son of David, carries messianic overtones and suggests that Bartimaeus looked to Jesus as Messiah who could bring healing and wholeness. Mark's use of the title Son of David gets readers prepared for the coming pericope of Jesus entering Jerusalem. Going back to the story, the crowd endeavored to silence Bartimaeus, but their attempts to silence him were futile. Bartimaeus refused to be silenced in the pursuit of Jesus, demonstrating a visible expression of his faith, as we Christians should show as well. Bartimaeus pleaded for healing and mercy. His plea resembles petitions to kings when requesting a special favor. Here, he is acknowledging Jesus as King and Messiah, as well as humbling himself to ask for a special favor. Jesus does not directly call for Bartimaeus. Instead, he tells the disciples to call him. In other words, the word of the Lord and his power are mediated and made effective through his disciples. Call quickly becomes a key word in this story. Jesus tells people to call Bartimaeus to him. This is not just a miracle story or a healing narrative as mentioned before, but it was also a call story. Jesus had not called anyone since the calling of the 12 disciples and Levi early on in the Gospel of Mark. This blind man jumps up at the call, demonstrating how the call of Jesus yields a response and people are to find the light which Christ gives. Not only that, after Bartimaeus was healed, he stripped off his coat, representing his old life, and chose to follow Christ. His coat was everything he had. He stripped off all of his belongings, left it behind in a crowd that chances are he'll never find again, just to pursue Christ. Throughout the Bible, we see the metaphor of changing clothes to convey that the old life is being taken off and a new sanctified life is being put on. The blind man threw off his coat. The blind man threw off his way of life before his encounter with Christ. Christ had not yet healed him before Bartimaeus shed his old life and came to Jesus. He wanted healing. He wanted a new life. He wanted to have confidence that comes through Jesus. And even though he had not yet been healed, Bartimaeus had this confidence. He put off his old way of life in response to faith. We see in Galatians 3:27, Ephesians 4:24, and Romans 13:14 the verb to put on clothes. When there are metaphors of changing clothes, It's a common way to point out new life that is acquired through baptism. Bartimaeus strips off his cloak, throws it aside, and jumps to his feet. The word for cloak in Greek is an outer robe that was worn over the inner nightshirt-like garment. And like I said before, for a beggar, a cloak may have been his only possession, and he was aware that tossing it, he may never find it again. Unlike the story of the rich man, Bartimaeus abdicated everything he possessed to answer Jesus' calling and follow him. Jesus asked him the same question that he asked to James and John earlier. What do you want me to do for you? While their answer was self-seeking, Bartimaeus' was simple. He responded with, Rabbi, I want to see again. The word again may imply that Bartimaeus at one point may have the ability to see. Metaphorically, when he is healed, this can be used as an encouragement to disciples whose eyes have been blinded, that they also can once again be restored to full sight. At the end of the story, we see Bartimaeus on the road instead of on the side. This signifies the difference from being an outsider to being an insider, from being a bystander to being a disciple. We see a lot of metaphors used in this passage, like Bartimaeus was physically blind. The crowd and disciples were still spiritually blind as to who Jesus was. Jesus was opposed by those who one would expect to support him, like religious leaders. While evil spirits recognized his true identity, his followers failed to understand who he was and what his mission was. They followed him and listened to him speak, yet they did not grasp the fact that he was God. He is a king who came down to save his people from their sins. This passage is evident of the reversal of values in the kingdom of heaven. We see Christ having compassion for a blind beggar instead of trying to shut him up. Bartimaeus is welcomed into the fellowship of believers. There are texts that recognize blindness as defiling and excluding the blind from the new people of God. However, we see another reversal of values with Jesus' actions. He transforms the impure and excluded into God's sanctified people. This passage is the second account in Mark of Jesus healing a blind man. In the Synoptic Gospels, Bartimaeus is the only person healed whose name was given. Even though we do not hear about his discipleship after his healing, the fact that Bartimaeus' name was reported suggests that he became a familiar face in the discipleship group. Even though he's never named again, it suggests that he becomes well known among the disciples. Blindness is the inability to see. We can talk about this literally or figuratively in this passage. Healing is the curing of an infirmity or injury through supernatural means in the biblical text. Even though he was blind, Bartimaeus sees Jesus more clearly than those who had two good eyes. The blind man ends up following Jesus after he is healed. The word healed in Greek also means saved, which combines both physical and spiritual healing. So as we end this, there's a few takeaways I want you to remember from this passage. Bartimaeus gives up all he has to pursue Christ's calling. In the same way, Christians are called to do the same. Bartimaeus grasps who Jesus was and addresses Jesus with the messianic title, Son of David. Bartimaeus persists to cry out to Jesus despite the crowd rebuking him and demanding him to be silent. His faith in Christ's transforming powers. He tosses aside his only possession, expecting to regain his sight and being brought into a place of wholeness. He acts and knows he will be healed before he is even healed. What faith is that? Amazing faith that we are called to have. Bartimaeus is the epitome of the model disciple. Mark takes us through this healing story and compels us to be like Bartimaeus. We have an intrinsic value because of our relationship with Christ. We have been adopted into his family of royalty, and we must act as such, and what it means to be made in the image of God. When we truly encounter Christ, we are transformed. When we encounter Christ, there is nothing that we don't want to abdicate or give up to follow Christ. We leave our old ways of living behind. Our blind eyes are open. So I hope you took something away from this. Thank you so much for coming and listening to me. And I'll see you guys next week with another story about how Jesus acted upon his compassion.